So what we're going to talk about here today is why content matters, how most marketers get it wrong, and then we're going to talk about how to create effective content, and we're going to go over some examples of some great content. So before we get started, let's talk about what is content. So it can be anything from a tweet. Wendy's does a great job of it. How many of you all follow Wendy's on Twitter? All right, some of the most sarcastic shit you will ever see. It's a great example of a company doing it right. It could also be anything up to, signage. Walmart recently announced that they're not selling any more handgun ammo and ammo for AR-15s. So that's an example of content. But it could be anything. Social media, blog posts, video, podcasts, media coverage. Pretty much anything that's getting your message out there is going to be considered content. So we're going to talk about 5 reasons why content matters first. And we'll go through some examples as we're going through this part. So the first reason is exposure. Now, we all know that in order to have a successful business, we need to expose ourselves, right? Not quite like that, though. So every business needs exposure because you need to get your brand, you need to get your message in front of potential customers, people who have the ability to buy your products or your services. Now, if you're not leveraging content right now, you're going to fall behind your competitors, all right? Even if they're not using it right now, eventually they will. But it's not a one-time thing, right? You can't build, or you can't produce a great video or a blog post or something like that and then just call it a day. It needs to be out there constantly, getting new stuff out there. That repetition is going to build trust and it's going to build awareness. But it's important that you get in front of the right audience, right? So let's say that you had a company selling grass-fed organic meat. It's not going to do you any good to have an article talking about, how great your meat is on a vegetarian website. So we need to make sure we're getting in front of the right people. And the beauty of this is that everything becomes exponential. So the more of it that's out there, the more opportunities you have for exposure. People start reaching out for you. They start coming to you asking for quotes on a particular topic in your industry, or they might just start, maybe you have a quote somewhere and they'll write that in one of their articles, or they'll talk about you in a video. So this kind of builds upon itself. It creates a snowball effect. Now, that doesn't mean that you take your foot off the gas, though, because you've always got competitors who are trying to catch up to you. So another reason that it's important is branding. So your content, if you're doing it right, is going to demonstrate exactly what your brand is about. So people today, they want to align with, or they want to buy from a company that aligns with their values. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with some of these companies. Can anyone tell me any of the values that Black Rifle Coffee Company stands for? Yes, veteran empowerment. In fact, Matt Best was on, I think it was Fox News just recently, talking about some of the programs they have for the veterans community. Chick-fil-A, Christian values. Patagonia is environmental issues. They've been giving money to all kinds of environmental causes for years, so they put their money where their mouth is. So if you think you can get around taking a position on social or political topics these days, you're living in kind of a fantasy world. It's not going to happen anymore, all right? We've come to a point where it's a very polarized world, right? People have this mindset that you're either with them or you're against them. And you don't have to look any further than the comment section on any social media post or an article to see that, right? If somebody goes there and you're not agreeing with their views, they pretty much think you should die in a fire. So we have to take a stand. We have to position ourselves on a particular set of values. So that being said, when you do this, your content is either going to attract people or it's going to repel people, right? Does anyone want to buy anything from that guy? So some people may see this as a bad thing, right? They think, I don't want to turn anybody away. I don't want to, maybe lose out on a customer. But that's not really how it works. It's actually, it's an upside, all right? And that's because what can turn some people into a very passionate fan can also make some people hate you. So the thing is that what helps to attract the right customers is also going to repel the wrong ones. And that's a good thing because the people who are the right customers, they're going to buy from you a lot more quickly. They'll be willing to pay a higher price. The people who aren't the right customers, if you spend a lot of time trying to convince them, you're going to waste a lot of time and probably not close them anyway. So this just helps you to have a more efficient business. A good example of this is, this event right here. We're all here because there's a sense of tribalism. We all come from a from a particular community, the veterans community. So that's a perfect example of it. Now, another aspect here is that personality is a critical part of branding. Now, whether we're talking about a person or we're talking about a company, there's a personality behind that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is part of why video is so effective. I assume most of you guys know who these folks are? All right. So Google recently reported that about 55% of consumers make purchasing decisions based on a video. And that's because you get an instant feel for somebody's personality, right? You either like somebody or you don't. You're going to see that pretty quickly, in the snap of a finger. So, based on things like how I move or how I carry my voice or the kind of words I use, facial expressions, things like that, I know that some people already like me. I also know that for those same exact reasons, there's some people that don't. I know who you are. The next thing is engagement. So what is engagement? Can anyone tell me? No. Okay. You?
It's like interacting or getting your customers to engage in your content or communicate with you.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. It's a two-way street. It's people who are talking either about you or with you, either way. And that's something that's it goes both ways, just like a relationship where you're standing face to face with them. Now, the one thing I do want to point out here is that you are a brand. You as an individual are a brand. It's not just the company. Those days are long behind us. Every successful business nowadays, I'm pretty sure that you could probably tell me who is the person behind that business, right? Do we know who the people are behind any of these companies here? Probably everybody in here, right? All right. So how do we get that? How do we get that engagement? Well, that comes from emotions. So you have to give them something to get emotional about. Now, that's pretty easy. One way to do that is give them something to either agree with or to disagree with. We've all been on social media. That shouldn't be tough to find. You could also work with, excitement or anger, joy, fear, anything like that. But once you start to trigger people's emotions, they're gonna get out there and, like I said, we're going to have people who are for us and people who are against us. So don't be upset when you start to have some people who are not cheering for the stuff you're doing. Now, I've got a great example of that. It's a good friend and a client of mine who is in the drug testing business. Now, you all have seen in the news, we've got a lot of talk about legalization of marijuana. So a lot of employers obviously are in favor of drug testing because it keeps a safe workplace. But we've also got people who are super pro-marijuana and they think you should be able to be high everywhere. I don't know about you, but I think if I get on the airplane and it smells like a Bob Marley concert coming out of the cockpit, I don't want to get in there. But that certainly will turn some people off and it will get them we'll say, riled up. So not all of the engagement's going to be positive. So this is a good example here. This was a gentleman here in the back of the room that runs the drug testing company. He did a video on YouTube about a particular type of drug test. So obviously, we talked about some of the people are going to be not super supportive of that. This gentleman here says, looks to me like you're smuggling about 150 kilos under your shirt. And while I would have no problem passing any of your tests, I'd be curious if you could pass a Golden Corral. Tom here says, making people afraid of the choices they make in their own free time. What wonderful people you are. Hopefully the diabetes takes you fast. So it seems kind of harsh, and it is, but that's okay. What you have to do is you have to develop thick skin, because that's going to happen. And even if you're not in a controversial type of industry, that's going to happen. You're going to have people who hate whatever you're doing for whatever reason. Maybe they're bored, mommy didn't love them enough, I don't know. So there's a couple different approaches you can take there. You can take the approach that a lot of companies do, and they just try to, change their mind. Who here has ever tried to change someone's mind online? Works great, right? All right. The approach that I prefer is just trolling the shit out of them. Just push their buttons, make them lose their shit. It's entertaining, and it's going to make them look ridiculous. So have fun with it. So another reason that content matters is it demonstrates your expertise, knowledge, and capabilities. People will they will eagerly buy from companies that they think can solve their problems quickly. Now, in order to do that, you need to understand their problems. You need to communicate in their language. Where I see a lot of companies go wrong is they say things like, oh, we're the biggest company in whatever city, or we've been around for 50 years. Customers don't give a shit about any of that. What you need to do is explain your process. You need to show them, demonstrate step by step how you're going to solve their problems. Now, somebody that does a great job of this, right there in the back of the room, Dennis Yu, I think a lot of you were probably in his presentation yesterday. He does a great example of this because he actually outlines their entire process step by step for managing Facebook advertising. You know, a lot of people will just get out there and they'll say, oh, we're the best, we have this secret proprietary method. That doesn't carry any weight. Nobody's going to buy that, but if you can show them step by step how you do the process, how you do everything, that's going to carry a lot of weight. And we're going to get more into, a lot of people are afraid to do that. I'll cover a little bit more on that later. So when we're talking about this type of content, we can also look at content that demonstrates your capabilities. This example up here on the top is an article that I wrote for Search Engine Journal. And it basically, step by step, exactly how to structure a page, all of the aspects of what goes into a well-optimized page. This here is an ebook from a friend of mine. She is a contributor to Entrepreneur and Forbes and several other publications, and also a PR expert. So that's another example. Or HubSpot produced this is kind of meta here, how to make a great how-to video. Going in depth on things like that, it carries a lot of weight in showing that you really know what you're talking about, that you know how to do what they need you to do. Now, sometimes you might be something a little bit shorter. This is an article that I was quoted in a while back. Actually, it tied into some military stuff, but that's a good example. When somebody sees you mentioned in the media in a large publication, that's another example of content that demonstrates your authority, your expertise. And these are usually very short. They're not going to write a whole article about you. They might include a quote here and there, and that's about the extent of it. Now, what I touched on a little bit ago was people who are afraid of talking about their process. Now, they're afraid that if they do this, that the customer is not going to need them. They'll just go and do it themselves, right? And on the surface, that seems logical. But that's a myth. It's a thing that doesn't exist, kind of like that. So you have to think about how much you know, right? We all, in our industry, we've got our knowledge that we spent years developing, years honing. There's so much that we know. It's not the things that you know that are going to help you succeed. It's the things that you don't know that are going to end up causing a problem. So whatever your industry is, you know, I'm a very high-tech industry. There may be some people who are, you know, in something less, maybe like construction or real estate, where the tech moves a little bit slower. But the fact of the matter is, what you know is still exponentially larger than 99.9% of your clients. So don't be afraid to share as much information as possible. And the people who want to do it themselves, they want to just take your information, that's fine. You don't want to deal with them anyway, because generally if somebody wants to DIY, they either don't have the money, or they don't value your services anyway. They think they know better than you, which is ridiculous, or they don't trust people. So you don't want to work with these people anyway. And also what happens is, when they take that approach and they realize how much work it really takes, they're probably going to come back to you anyway. So don't be afraid to share that information. And then the last one is authority. So expertise plus social proof is what equals authority. So social proof, who's all familiar with this term here? All right, so for those of you who aren't, social proof is basically you're earning authority by proxy from being associated with something. Whether it be a large publication or the news, or you're speaking at an event, whatever, any of these things. People generally look at news, or they look at these large business publications, or maybe an industry trade pub, and they assume there's a particular bar set for somebody to be quoted in there, or for somebody to be a contributor there. And that's generally true, right? These publications or these television channels, they've got their own audience. They want to maintain people's respect for them, so they are going to hold that bar high. So in order for this to happen, you have to find a way to get quoted or get a column or be featured in any of these publications. And the reason here that this is important is, with your own website, you have full control. So you're generally not going to get on your website and be like, hey, I'm terrible. You're going to sit there and tell them you're the best company in the world and this, that, and the other. But these publications are generally considered objective, right? They have no advantage in promoting you unless you actually are qualified. So we could be looking at tier 1 pubs like Entrepreneur, Forbes, Inc., any of the major business or magazines for your industry, any kind of radio or television, trade pubs, and even local publications like your local media, newspapers, magazines, things like that. The thing is, you have to work your way up the ladder. All right, you're not going to go from, hey, I just started a business to, I want to be featured in CNN, right? You don't go from boot camp to Force Recon, so it's the same thing here. Now, in order for that to happen, in order for you to get that kind of coverage, it requires original and useful content. Now, for those of you who did say that you produce content regularly, how many of you are writing? Okay. From what I've seen, most of the people who are writing, at least the ones who are doing it sporadically, it kind of sounds like a drunk toddler wrote it. So in order to get featured, you have to be able to convey your message effectively. The editors are going to be very specific about who they're allowing in. So what you have to do is you have to produce a decent library of effective content. Now, it could be videos, could be written articles, it could be email, it could be all kinds of things. But you have to have stuff that you can demonstrate that you are capable of conveying your message effectively. Now, that's generally going to, once you get from that point to then reaching out to these, whether it be editors, contributors, when you're getting to reach out to them and ask them to cover you or ask them to be a contributor somewhere, that's going to require a relationship, right? Most people do this wrong. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second and how to solve that problem. But the short version is you want to consistently add value, right? You're reaching out to them. You have to make it about them, whether it's the editor or the contributor, right? Think about it from the perspective of a contributor, right? You've got a contributor who's writing articles for Entrepreneur. They have particular things that they need to write. If it's unrelated to what they're doing, reaching out and pitching them is not going to have any value for either of you. So you need to find out what they're doing, follow their work, and then engage with them and try to add value along the way. Just like you would, you're not going to walk up to somebody in the street and be like, hey, will you marry me? You have to build a relationship, and you have to add value so that they actually want to cover you. A good way to do that is look at some of the groups. How many of you here use Facebook or LinkedIn, we'll say daily? All right. So there's a lot of groups on both of these networks that are specifically for, whether it be for industries, for people who are trying to build a name for themselves, for people who are trying to build a brand. A good example of that is there's one called Amplifiers. Anyone here familiar with that? I know you are, Dennis. All right. So that's a group. It's got everybody ranging from brand new people starting out all the way up to large personal brands, contributors at giant publications, producers for television, you name it. Everybody's there. And the purpose of that group is for people to be able to build their own personal brand. And it's actually run by a fellow vet, brilliant guy, Michael Toothman. If you guys aren't in there, I encourage you to go check it out. Yeah, Facebook. So quick word on editors. I mentioned that most people, and this applies to contributors a little bit as well, most people approach this wrong. It's, hey, can you write an article about me when they're in a totally different industry, right? So they kind of have a sometimes rude or entitled mindset. The thing you have to realize is editors are gatekeepers, and it's a very small, tight-knit community. They talk amongst themselves. So if you make a bad impression on one, it's probably going to go around. They're going to talk, and you're probably not going to get in anywhere. So be very careful how you approach them. The other thing is editors they will make your content better. How many here have ever been a little bit punched in the gut when somebody tells you that this needs to be written better or this needs to be tweaked or adjusted, right? We all take that a little bit personally. But try not to do that if you are talking with an editor and they're telling you that, because the fact of the matter is first of all, this is what they do all day, every day. They're editing content. They know how it needs to be structured, but they also know what their audience wants. So if they're telling you something, that's really in everyone's best interest. It's a win for them, it's a win for you, and it's a win for the audience. It's basically a symbiotic relationship. For my grunts in the room, we have any grunts in here? No? All right, never mind then. All right, so how do most brands get content wrong? Well, first, they don't use it, right? When I asked earlier, I think about half the room raised their hands, right? A lot of people, they think it doesn't work because they go and they write a couple of blog posts or they make a couple of videos. Dennis touched on an interesting thing yesterday where with the Facebook ads, he said about 9 out of 10 don't have any effect whatsoever. They aren't good. They don't work. And that's going to be the case with your content as well, all right? A lot of your content's not going to really resonate, and that's okay. It's a numbers game to some degree. It still has to be great quality content, but you do have to have a lot of it out there. But a lot of people also think it's too much work. If you're writing an article, it takes a fair amount of work. Typically, if I'm writing a 1,000-word article, it's going to take me about an hour. But then what you can do is you can actually take that 1,000 words and you can break it up into a series of tweets that you can then use and repurpose it that way. Or do a video on the topic, or then go on another podcast and talk about it. So there's a lot of ways that you can get more out of the time that you've invested in this. And one more way is they are scared. Who here is excited about the idea of being on video? Even fewer hands. Most people are terrified of video, and that's okay. All of the things that you're going to say on a video or the little mistakes that you might make, nobody's going to notice that except you, and that's if you obsess about it and go watch it 100 times. When I produce a video, I don't even watch it. I just crop the ends and publish it. So don't be afraid to do it. Nobody's really going to pay that much attention to it. That was not worded the best, but yeah. So another problem is that the content's not engaging. They tend to make it self-centered. It's all about them. We talked earlier how you have to use their vocabulary, speak to their level of knowledge. When you do that, they're going to get the impression that you really understand them, that you really know what they need and you can help solve their problems. You know, if I'm writing an article about search engine optimization, I might talk about, JavaScript minification and algorithms and who knows what else. Super technical things that most people don't have any interest in. But if I'm writing that same article for a publication like Entrepreneur, I'm probably going to bring it down a little bit to where it's less technical. It's a little more surface level. So think of it from that perspective. Another problem is their message is generally dry and boring. And we talked earlier how you have to incorporate your personality into your brand. And the same applies for content. The same way that we like or don't like certain people, the same is going to apply for your content. So don't be afraid to let your personality shine through in your brand. And then a lot of people, of course, fail to leverage storytelling. Does anyone know why storytelling is important in your content?
People can relate to it because they sort of get the arc of any story and they can kind of put themselves into it, and it condenses the idea into a much shorter space.
Perfect. That is definitely one aspect. As they visualize it, it kind of resonates in a different way. Were you going to say something?
Yeah, I think people remember it better.
They do. I mean, that's why in history, we've always passed down history through storytelling. But there is one more reason. Partially. Who knows what oxytocin is? All right. So for those of you who don't, it is the hormone that your body produces that makes you feel good. It creates a sense of trust. And when you're storytelling, it triggers people's bodies to produce oxytocin. So they now feel good. They associate you with that feel-good feeling. They associate you with trust because that's what it's doing in their body. So the last problem is they don't promote it. And this is one I will never understand. Why are you going to go through all this effort, all of this time, and produce great content, pour your heart into it, put all of your intelligence into this work, and then just let it sit somewhere, tucked away on your blog, or buried on the 50th page of YouTube? You need to get out there and promote that content. It's not just sharing it on Facebook. It's not just putting it on your website. Because as far as Facebook goes, Dennis, what's the organic reach nowadays? 2%. 2%. So if you have 100 fans, which is not very many, only 2 of them are going to see that content, generally, right? That's not very good odds. So you need to promote it, not just by sharing it on social once, share it regularly, and that applies for we're going to break this down into two categories. We've got what I call evergreen content, which is stuff that's generally going to be good forever. And then we've got something that's more like news type of content. So we talked earlier about marijuana legalization. That would be an example of something that's kind of news related. In 2 years, none of that content's going to matter. But the evergreen content, you want to share that regularly. And then you also want to do paid ads for that. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But we also want to link build. Does anyone here do link building for their website, for their content? No. You. Okay, one person. All right, so why do we want to do this? Well, we want to do this because we can potentially get referrer traffic from this website over to yours or to your content, wherever it is. If we're talking about your own website, then that link carries weight from an SEO perspective. So if you've got these other people linking to your content, you're going to do better in organic search. Now, when we talk about paid social, we've got two ways we can do this. We can do paid ads to put our message in front of our customers. Of course, we're all going to do that. But we also want to do paid ads targeting the media. Now, not with all of our content, but with some of it, where it makes sense. Dennis, who is no longer here, he just stepped out. He had a great strategy that I picked up a couple years ago from him, where he's got a custom audience developed based on people that work for media organizations, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all kinds of newspapers. And then he puts that story in front of them. So let's say you've got a reporter or a producer and they're working on a particular story. If they see something that's an answer to something they're trying to write about, they're going to reach out to you. So it's a great way to get media coverage for a lot less money than hiring a PR agency. And it's just a good way to get exposure. So let's talk about how to create content, effective content, and we're going to go through some of these examples. Now, right now, there's a lot of content out there, and most of it, nobody cares about. Most content, I forget the exact stats, but somewhere in the range of like 95% of the content that's out there has no social shares and no links to it. So it's not getting any traffic anywhere. What we're going to do is we're going to break down the process of creating this content, and process is really important, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, it reduces the effort that goes into this, right? If you know exactly how you're going to do this, you're spending less time spinning your wheels. It's also more scalable. If you have a documented process and you have to bring somebody else in, you've got another employee or somebody new that you just hired and you need to have them do that particular task, if there's a process, they can do that task without you having to be over their shoulder the whole time. And the other reason is that it provides more consistent results. We want to try and get as much impact out of all of our content as possible, and the process, having a documented process, helps us to do that. So the first thing we need to do is generate topics. Now, obviously, we need to do this based on content people will care about. Most marketers, we talked about this earlier, they do it from their own perspective, and that's a huge mistake. They have a different vocabulary, right? I might talk about algorithms or bounce rates, domain metrics, things like that. But if I'm talking to a client, all they want to know is, hey, how can we get more customers on our site and get them to buy from us? They don't care about all the technical stuff. They also have a different level of knowledge, right? You're doing whatever you do all day, every day. So you know things that they don't know. I talked about how if I'm writing for Search Engine Journal versus Entrepreneur, it's two totally different levels of technical stuff. And because of that difference in knowledge and the difference in vocabulary, they ask a lot of different questions that you probably wouldn't consider. A good example of this is I was going through the domain analytics for David's company a while back, and like I mentioned, they do drug testing. One of the questions that somebody had typed into Google to end up on David's site was, can I pass a drug test by drinking bleach? In case you're wondering, the answer is no. Don't try this at home. But people just don't understand things the same way that you do. So keep that in mind. The problem is most marketers really don't understand their audience. If you guys have ever watched a military movie, you probably know what I'm talking about, right? Hand grenades do not blow up like that. So you have to do this from your audience's perspective. So we need data in order to do that. There's a ton of tools available. We've got, you can use Google. They've got all kinds of tools for looking up keyword ideas, SEMrush, keyword.io. There's a ton of tools out there for looking up keyword data. Now, I do want to point out that this data is not necessarily perfect all the time. We were looking at something for a client, and we had analytics to both websites. It was a friendly competitor of theirs. And this particular term, we knew that it had thousands of visits every month, but every single keyword tool we looked at said 0. So if there's something that's important in your industry, but the keyword tools are telling you it's not, there's no volume for it, don't necessarily rule it out. Another thing you can do is you can mine your competitors' websites. Now, I wrote an article on Search Engine Journal about this, where it basically breaks it all down step by step of exactly how to go through a competitor's website, find out what they're ranking for, how much traffic they're getting for those things, and then you can start developing content based around those topics. Another option is the question and answer sites. We all know about Quora, Yahoo Answers, but there's also a ton of other ones out there. I was looking at, there's a company called Stack Exchange. They actually have over 175 different question and answer sites for various, very specific niches. So you can probably find a niche that makes sense for you, something that's relevant to your industry, and you can go there and start seeing the kind of questions people are asking. Now, I will warn you, you're going to see a lot of really stupid questions that will make you question the future of the human race. So keep that in mind. We can look at social media. We can search by hashtags. We can also look at competitors. We can see what they're writing about. We can see what their customers are writing about on their page. We can look at our own comments and PMs, things like that. BuzzSumo. Is anyone familiar with this? All right. So it's a great tool. You can go plug any kind of topic into it, and it's going to tell you the content that's recently been produced about that. It tells you like what kind of engagement it's getting on different networks. It tells you how many links are pointing to that content. So you can get a feel for what is really engaging in your industry, and that can give you some insight as to some topics. Now, once we've got these general topics, what we have to do is we have to give the audience something to be passionate about. So how do we do that? Well, we have to trigger emotions. Now, when I say trigger emotions, we're talking about theirs, not yours. I don't want you guys going like Michael Douglas and falling down. The way we can do this is incorporating certain topics into our content. So political or social issues is a great one, right? People are very black and white on a lot of these things. Second Amendment, marijuana, environmental issues. So in the case of marijuana, right, we all know that it provides some benefits for like MS, Parkinson's disease, PTSD, things like that. But we also know that there is danger associated with it, right? You don't want your pilot flying high. So there's not a lot of gray area here. This approach isn't necessarily right for everyone, though. So you have to really think that through and make sure that it makes sense for your audience. And then you also have to make sure that the topics that you're using make sense for your audience. So everybody here familiar with Matt Best? Okay. His audience clearly is generally pro-gun, pro-military, comfortable with violence and dark humor. If you guys haven't seen his ISIS button video, I encourage you guys to check that out as soon as you have a chance. It's absolutely hilarious, very dark. But an example of somebody doing this poorly is Gillette. They recently did this video about toxic masculinity, whatever, and then 2 more videos after that that generated a lot of controversy. They pissed off a lot of people and ended up having a Q4 loss of $5.2 billion. Now, I don't know if that was all because of that, but they did make a very public statement that they're getting away from making social issues in their marketing. So, you do the math. My next example, I'll preface this by saying I am not a fan of any politician, but this is an example where there's no benefit, right? For those of you who maybe can't see it back there, it's Trump with tape over his face. That really has nothing to do with phones or phone service. You're going to alienate roughly half your audience. There's no upside to it. And like I said, phone service has nothing to do with politics. Maybe if they had taken a stand for net neutrality, which is not really an issue anymore, or privacy, that would be a topic that makes sense for them. So nostalgia is another way to leverage people's emotions. Almost everyone can relate certain movies to certain periods of their life, right? For me, I became infatuated with the military after I saw a certain movie. I was quite a little kid at the time, I think. I don't remember exactly. But how many guys in here have seen this movie? All right. It's about as cheesy as you can get, but this was the epitome of 80s action movies, right? So we all have movies that we can relate to at some point in our life, whether it's a period of time or an event or a relationship, whatever. When you can leverage things like this into your content in some way, that's a great way, right? Like maybe I could write an article about 7 things I learned about marketing from The Matrix. One of the best examples I've seen of this was I was at an event for authors in the Tampa Bay area recently. Sorbani Banjari wrote this book called Hide With Me. And as she's standing up here speaking about this book, she explained it as a cross between The Goonies and Stranger Things, where the kids then go and take on the cartels. It's ridiculous, right? But everyone I've ever talked to either loves or hates that movie and that show. I have never seen anybody who's like, oh, it's okay. So you've got that. It's a very polarizing thing in that regard. They kind of have a cult following. But the other side of it is, as kids, like we all dreamed about taking on these ridiculous, unfair battles, right? I mean, think back to your own daydreams and all the things that you were going to do when you were a kid. But also look at some of the kids' movies, right? We had Home Alone and The Monster Squad, where these kids are doing things that most adults couldn't even do. So when you're doing this, you know, you're doing something to leverage their emotion. We talked about how that's going to attract the right customers and turn away the ones that aren't. And what you're doing when you do this is you create this tribalism. So a good example of that is the Suit Soldier podcast. Evidently, I don't have the slide in here for it. But he's actually, the Suit Soldier podcast is run by Chris Corker, who's actually handling a lot of the podcast stuff here for the event. It's basically a podcast about transitioning vets. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that you can really get behind if you're in that community. So the next one is current events. Pop culture, local or national news, holidays, whatever may be coming up that's just a timely type of thing. So Search Engine Journal did this great one. It's a holiday marketing guide. It's basically an ebook that you can download. And what they did was they got several prominent people in the digital marketing community to get together and contribute a chapter here. So obviously you've got a little bit of nostalgia here too on top of the current events, right? Like we've all got great Christmas memories, things like that. Joel Comm, do we all know who he is? All right. So Google has been kind of stepping all over everything lately, and you know, all kinds of privacy issues, all kinds of, they're now talking about potentially enforcing additional regulations on them or potentially breaking them up because of some of the things they're doing. Joel Comm actually wrote the first book about AdWords, and he's been a huge proponent of Google for years, for like 20 years now. But because of what they've been doing now, he wrote this article talking about, or this post rather, talking about how all of the things that they're doing is turning him away from them. And he went from being their biggest advocate to now one of their biggest detractors. And he's got the audience for that to have impact. So that's another example of current events. Black Rifle Coffee Company. If veterans were in horror movies. And that is about as ridiculous as you can imagine, so definitely go watch that one. It's loads of fun. And they released that one around Halloween time, I think maybe 2 years ago. This is an example of an article that is Christmas themed. So you've got a lot of options. Here's another one. Dennis Yu was talking on CNN. This was back during the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Do we all remember that? So very newsworthy event. They had him come on, talk about that, and then he had several. How many did you end up having because of that?
What?
Interviews on CNN.
Oh, they won't have 5 more times.
All right. So,
Thanks, Zuckerberg, for that.
and I want to touch something on that one. Once you are in that loop, you're going to be the one they reach out to. So if you can get out there, and do that, then you're pretty much set. You're going to start getting content, start getting asked to come on and be a contributor regularly. Starbucks here. This is a simple one. Doesn't have to be complex. It's just a little, maybe 5-second video for Halloween. It says, "You go ghoul." Simple. I don't think it maybe took more than 15 minutes to put that together. So we need to put the content in front of the right audience. I'm trying to rush through this because I know some people will have some questions. So where do we do that? Well, we do that on our own website, right? Obviously, you're going to publish a blog post or publish a page, post a PDF on your website, whatever the case may be. Email your list. Social media, both paid and organic. Inbound links. You want to reach out to other websites that are related to you and have them link to your content. Third-party websites like Entrepreneur, Inc., local pubs, whatever the case there, whatever's relevant for you. Podcasts, television, and radio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip this section, and we'll just jump to the Q&As. All right, so that's our recap. Do we have any questions?
How do you measure the ROI of your content?
That depends. How precisely do you want to measure it? You cannot. There's no precise way to measure it. Certain things you can measure. You can measure certain KPIs, and you have to figure out what KPIs matter for your business. That could be, you could be looking at the overall quantity of leads that you're generating on a regular basis, but you can't tie like a specific piece of content to a metric like that. So it's kind of a holistic, it all works together kind of approach. Does that answer? All right. I saw a hand over there somewhere. Yes?
So for a new brand, new startup brand, would you suggest brevity as well, or would you suggest at first maybe over-communicating a little bit about what you're trying to bring to the table, and then would you suggest working towards brevity?
I think you incorporate both. Some people are going to sit there and read a long, lengthy post. Some people just want to see something short and punchy. And so work them both in and keep continuously going on both of them. And work all channels too, not just a social post, but a post, a blog, video, podcast, a little bit of everything.